Episode 70, May the 1st to the 3rd, 1915. Retreating on Eat the Dead and the Secret Gun in the Night by Stanley Casson. Read by John Winskill. Mr. Stanley Casson is both one of the most distinguished living archaeologists and a writer of distinction. He served in Flanders with the 1st East Lancashire. His moving description of the difficult days which marked the ending of the Second Battle of Ypres is a gem of war literature. From Vlamertinghe, we marched east, and soon night was on us, but night lit by a vivid and lovely moon. In a short time, we were in the outskirts of Ypres, a shattered ruin of houses. We halted, formed into single file, and began to cross the town. It was a strange and uncanny sight, this corpse of a city that had just died. The smooth cobbled streets and squares were pitted with enormous holes, and great pools of blood lay here and there. Dead horses from scurrying guns and limbers lay in swollen heaps, putrefying the very air itself. The moon made every line clear and stark, and every shadow a patch of sepia. Almost every moment, here or there, a violent flash of orange marked the burst of a shell. The continuous booming of the German guns, which seemed so very near, was broken only at intervals, and those intervals formed shocked silences, as eerie as the moonlight. Once or twice a sound like that of an electric train rushing through the air made us pause, fear-struck. An immense explosion and a blinding flash told us that here were the projectiles of the largest gun of all. In one place, we threaded our way past a vast crater in the road, which was one of the holes made by this famous gun. The night was hot and airless, and we dripped with sweat. Pervading everything was the reeking stench of dead horses and dead men. Only once did we see a living thing in this murdered city, when a dark ambulance came tearing through the streets, picking its way with incredible skill and never pausing for a second, almost as if the Furies were pursuing it. At length we emerged from this nightmare land, crossed the old battered moat through what was once the Menin Gate, and we were out in the open country once more. Here at last we were back again in the sort of setting that we knew, but it was grimmer than anything we had seen. Great streamers of smoke from the smouldering city covered the sky, but away east was the line that we knew, clear to us as on any map, by the long row of constant star shells. Behind us was the crash of intermittent shells falling on Ypres. In front, the crackle of infantry fire. We paused by the roadside and formed up into column. A few hundred yards on, we had an hour's rest, and most of us slept, coldly but solidly, in the moonlight by the hedges. At length, we moved into a battered row of half-dug trenches that formed a reserve position in the very centre of the salient, which, it was clear enough by now, was the spearhead of a defence and the main objective of attack in a prolonged battle. Here were no quiet times where we and the Germans could snipe and stand to and sleep and patrol. This was a battle for a purpose, and the only purpose of the Germans must be to break through. When dawn broke in our battered support trench, it was evident enough that we were all in the hollow of a great bowl, with the Germans sitting on the rim and shooting at us. We spent 3 days here, continuously on the alert, for we had orders to stand by to be sent in support in any direction. Our little battalion was serving the purpose of reserve for a whole army corps, for we were short of men and the line was thinly held. But we had a superb view of the long line of battle. In effect, it was an isosceles triangle which was being attacked along the whole length of its long sides. The short base was Ypres itself. At night, we could see the flares and star shells running almost all around us. The main road, along which all the traffic of reinforcements and supply went, bisected the base of the triangle and ended at this point. Some cynic remarked, truly enough, that if you walked from Ypres along this road, you could be hit from almost every possible angle except from directly behind, so that the only invulnerable part of your body would be the long, thin line down the spine. We were on a small eminence, and away towards the village of St. Julian, we could look down over our own and the German lines. Just about sunset, on a calm evening, I was looking in this direction when slowly the long brown line of trenches and earth began to change to a dull, luminous green. Looking intently, I saw great clouds of greenish-yellow vapour creeping across from the German lines and all clearly issuing from one or two fixed points. We had heard talk of gas, and we had once or twice detected the smell of strange chemical odours, but here was a gas attack, a mile away, which I could see in action with my own eyes. It was, in fact, one of the last attempts of the Germans to use chlorine and, like its predecessor, which had occurred before we moved up, it failed. Our seniors were alarmed and waited for advice, for they saw that at any moment we might be called upon to deal with a situation that neither they nor we had ever been trained to meet. Unexpectedly, help came. A parcel was delivered for each company, labelled Gas Masks Type 1. Unpacked, the parcel revealed bundles of small squares of blue flannel, just large enough to cover the mouth, with a tape on each side to tie around behind the head. Whatever benign personage contrived these amiable death traps, I do not know, but anything more futile could never have been devised by the simplicity of man. On the whole, we preferred to resort to face towels dipped in our own urine, which an earlier order had suggested would be a temporary palliative. Nor was our confidence restored a day later by the arrival of gas marks Type 2, which was to replace the first. On unpacking my particular bundle, I found that the new masks consisted of large pieces of hairy Harris tweed about 3 feet long and 1 in width, again with tapes nattily fixed to the sides. With much laughter, the men tried to don their new masks, but at the bottom of the parcel I found a small printed label briefly entitled Body Belts. So, without further inquiries, I ordered my men to put them to whatever use seemed best to them. To a man, they placed them round their long-suffering stomachs. But local genius did more. The authorities on the spot, with incredible and commendable speed, brought up hundreds of vine growers' sprays. These we had use in the trenches, filled with the chemicals to neutralize chlorine. At last our time for action came. On the final day in our trenches, the fire along the line became intense as we waited and watched. Suddenly, over the skyline ahead of us ran two distraught figures. They flopped into our trenches exhausted without rifles or equipment. "We are the last of the Buffs, sir," cried one. "The Germans attacked and the regiment is wiped out." I gave them some rum and found them rifles and equipment, comforted them, and told them to get ready for more fighting. A moment later, a signaller came running madly down to us. "The Germans are coming over in their thousands, sir," he said, panting. "They have broken through." We all got ready, fixed our bayonets, and looked martial, when a group of four more men came tumbling over. "We are the last of the Buffs, sir," they cried. This was too much for my witty Lancashire men, and we all roared with laughter. "Come and meet some of your friends," I said, and took them along to the first pair. They began to look foolish, and then they also laughed. Indeed, we all enjoyed ourselves quite a lot. And of the Germans in their thousands, there was no trace. Actually, a small trench had been lost to the enemy, and these men had managed to get away. But it was a lesson in how a stampede starts. For the line was as strong as a rock, and there was no general attack. I kept the men with me, and in half an hour they were as ready as the rest to move up again when wanted. The dramatic touch amused me. I suppose the title of Buffs leads to cliches. The men had done too much reading of the newspapers in quiet trenches. They could hardly help coining the phrase, for in their ears it must have sounded heroic. There was something distinguished in being the last of the Buffs. But the distinction was becoming too popular, and their sense of humour saved them at last. But the battle was being pressed in earnest, and the position in the salient had become impossible, for the long triangle was being whittled down to a thinness almost impossible for habitation. It is one thing to hold the front against the enemy, but another to be shot in the back from the enemy on the other side of the triangle. And that was what was happening. Our trenches in some places could be fired at from behind by German artillery south of Ypres. The higher command took a wise decision. We were told that day that the salient was to be abandoned, except for a stump that was to be held around the city of Ypres. The great spearhead was to be cut off. Our part was to go up at night to the trenches and man them while their occupants withdrew. We were to stay there an hour or so and then leave ourselves, selecting a score of men and officers to stay behind and fire at intervals to disguise the fact that the trenches were abandoned. These in turn were to depart at dawn and find their way back. We formed up at dusk and marched over broken ground into trenches that led us to a sloping hill with the vague outlines of trees near it. As we neared, silence was ordered, and, unexpectedly, we found ourselves filling a trench that was already crammed with those whom we relieved. But they were battered and broken, and as we filled up the narrow trench that we were to occupy for barely a few hours, we could not help treading as we went on wounded and dying men. To this day, I shall remember those cries of the wounded as they begged us not to leave them behind when we went. As I turned a bend, I trod unintending on a figure heaped up in a shadow. He cried out in agony. I could think of nothing that could conceivably be said to him, for in such a case there is nothing to say. And I had to press on, for the Germans were hardly 70 yards away, And such was the confusion of the relief that, had they turned machine guns on the trenches, we should have been shot like rabbits. It was a matter of life and death to us all, and the wounded had to give way to the prime consideration of the whole and the living. We did indeed attempt to get back all the wounded we could, but any hint to the Germans that we were abandoning the salient, and a storm of artillery would have torn up the roads and caught us all in the open. There was no moon yet, and we finally took up our fire positions in the trench, firing actively so as to give no hint of the coming retreat. In due course, our orders came, and all but the percentage of officers and men who were to be left behind as a skeleton garrison moved out into the open ground behind the trenches and formed up into column. There was a deathly silence from the German side, and at any moment we expected attack, or at least to be swept by rifle fire and guns. But nothing happened, and strung up to the highest tension, we marched off towards the spinal road of the salient that would take us back behind the new lines, which, we were told, were already held and manned ready for the German advance, which would take place on the morrow. We reached the road simultaneously with other columns and a pack of men here and there, 10 abreast, units confused, companies mixed, and officers searching for their men like lost spirits filled up the whole surface. At intervals, ambulances, packed beyond their capacity, pushed doggedly through the moving column, and over all was a soft and velvety darkness. There was indeed confusion, and yet it took but little trouble when at last we crossed the canal at Ypres to get ourselves sorted out. I knew my destination, and at a point about a mile from where we started, I moved my small platoon across open country with the aid of a night compass. I'd never done this before except in barrack squares, and had never dreamed that it would ever come in handy. We had a long and rough march. For the first night, as if by some providence, the Germans neglected to shell the roads. It was the one night when their harvest would have been a rich one. At last we came to the canal and the outskirts of battered Ypres. We passed through the new lines and heard the cheerful shouts of those who were manning it and were waiting for the dawn where they would be able to pick off Germans as they advanced to the new position. We shouted back, bandied a joke or two, and went on. Belgians near the canal waved to us, and at last we reached the village of Elverdinge. Dawn was now well up, and as the sun rose, we filed into the delightful garden of an old castle with an ornamental lake. But it was raining hard, and we found shelter under trees and hedges. Food appeared in due course, but the Germans were shelling every thicket and every copse, and it was not long before we were moved off to shelter farther back in a wood. There we had a magnificent rest, sprawling in the sun, washing in streams, and resting to our heart's content. Fragments of the armies of our allies appeared among the trees, Moroccans with high turbans, French cuirassiers with brass helmets, like London firemen, and coloured zouaves. The men foregathered with all alike, talking unaffectedly in the lingua franca of the Low Countries that all Englishmen have always talked when fighting in Flanders. That night, I slept the solid sleep of the healthy exhausted. At breakfast, I heard some of the men of the transport column telling a stranger tale of a secret gun in the woods nearby, said to be kept underground and fired at night by Germans disguised as Belgian peasants. I never found out the origin of the story, but it was firmly believed. It was asserted that the gun was used to fire upon our own guns from behind, and that the Germans had been deliberately left behind there for that purpose after the original German withdrawal of some months before. That night, we did in fact hear every now and then the whistle of a shell from a gun near the suspect wood, and it sounded unlike the whistle of our own shells. This was good enough evidence for the men, and they all agreed that there was a secret gun in action. I have often wondered about the origin of that story.
Goodbye, goodbye. Why the tea, baby, tea from your honey? Though it's hard to part, I know. I'll be taken to death, I know. Don't cry, don't sigh. There's a silver lining in the sky. But swallowed think, cheerio, chin chin. Now pull toodle-oo, goodbye. Brother Bert, he went away to do his bit the other day. With a smile on his lips and his lieutenant lips upon his shoulder, bright and gay. As the train moved out, he said, remember me to all the birds, though he wagged his paw and went away to war, shouting out these pathetic